this is what this segment of the video is going to be about. We're not going to get into a lot of the kind of debate about Brexit, etc., but within it, we have to look at some key facts. Britain, since the time it joined to the time it's now leaving, has always been a net contributor to the budget of the EU. One important thing to recognise is that Britain has put in a net of about £200 billion into the coffers of the EU. So that's us putting more money in than we've been given back in terms of subsidies or grants or as part of the rebate. If we add up that, that's an extra £200 billion, which could have been spent in Britain on whatever it wants to be spent on, and it also would have freed us up to do a lot more other things. Now, there's an argument of if we hadn't been in, would we have had the same access to trade? Would our economy have been as good? Some arguments to say that we would have been in a worse financial situation if we hadn't joined, and that us joining helped boost a lot of the productivity and growth that came in the 70s and 80s. We're not going to get into that at this time because there's a degree of debate about that and a degree of speculation. If Britain had a free trade deal with the EU, then a lot of those things probably could have been eased over. And actually, the EU ended up having a lot of free trade deals with other countries, partly because of our influence within it. The effect that it would have had on Britain itself wouldn't have been as big as people suppose it would have. At the end of the day, the EU, for all that there's been debate about it, hasn't had that much of an impact on Britain. In regard to immigration, for instance, mass migration from the EU came in the period from about 2004 onwards, with the Eastern European countries joining the common market. If we'd never been in, there might have been slightly less migration from EU countries. Other than that, there wouldn't have been as much of an impact as people would have supposed. Brexit was always about money, laws and borders. So as we said, the money side of it, we would have had net 200 billion, assuming all else being equal. The laws, 97% of all laws that the EU passed were agreed by the British Parliament. There wouldn't have been that much difference there, and the laws that were imposed haven't really had that big of an impact on Britain. Certainly some of the regulations, maybe you could argue that economic growth might have been greater if we hadn't had those regulations, or it might have been worse. A lot of this is kind of speculative. And then in terms of borders, obviously with immigration, we wouldn't perhaps have had as much mass migration in the last 10-15 years if this timeline had gone differently. But I don't really see as much of an impact on Britain itself. However, for the EU itself, I think it would have had a much bigger impact. And that's not to say that the EU needs Britain more than Britain needs the EU, but it's just a fact of Britain's influence during its time of being a member has been quite decisive. If we look at the original 6 countries, they have always wanted to head more towards federalisation, of centralisation, of ever closer union, and Britain has always been the fly in the ointment, as it were. Has always been the one who's held that back, has always been the one that slowed the progress towards that. We've opted out of Schengen, we've opted out of the Euro, we've opted out of so many different things. Because of us being a restraining force on that path towards federalisation, it's meant that the rest of the EU has had to kind of accommodate us in some regard. So they have changed their approach, always having to bear us as the most sceptical and most powerful sceptical nation in mind. Without us being in there, probably would have meant that they would have headed towards federalisation a lot sooner. They probably might have had an EU army by now. It probably would have headed a lot more in that direction, and we wouldn't have had to negotiate as much. A little known fact by many people is that in the 1960s and 70s, there were 2 competing European trading blocs. Britain was part and one of the founding nations of EFTA, European Free Trade Association. Us being a founding member, we made up a huge chunk of their economy. For my calculations, it's roughly about a third of the total GDP. We were very influential within that bloc, and we set up that bloc along with many other countries as a opposing bloc. So there was the Outer Seven, which was Britain, Denmark, Austria, Portugal, Sweden, Norway, I said Denmark, I can't remember off the top of my head now, right? Finland as well, I believe. You had the Outer Seven, which we were part of, and then you had the Inner Six, which was what became the EU. If Britain hadn't left EFTA to then go and join the EU in 1973, I think that a lot of other countries wouldn't have done that either. Denmark, for instance, joined the EU at the same time as us, so it left EFTA and joined the EU. Sweden and Austria both left EFTA and joined the EU in 1995. Portugal joined in 1986, I believe. Quite a lot of countries end up joining the bloc that thinking, well, okay, so France and Germany and Italy are already part of it, and now Britain's part of it. Now this is the kind of in club, like there's no serious competing bloc. For us to be fully European, we're going to have to join this bloc. You see Spain join, you've seen Greece join, and then with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, you then start to see that from 2004 onwards, you start to see a lot of Eastern European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, kind of Hungary, all these places joining the bloc. I think that if Britain hadn't left EFTA, quite a lot of those countries would have actually preferred to have been part of EFTA, because EFTA is just focusing on free trade. There's no parliament, there's no trying to like centralize things. It's literally just a free trade association, right? And member states can operate as they want. And countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, which we're seeing in the news now, causing lots of like kind of problems for the EU because the EU's like imposing laws on them and they don't want those laws, etc. I think that if they had had two choices of two different blocks, I think they would have chosen the block which would have been less interfering in their like domestic policy. And so as a result of that, I think that what you could potentially have had is, say for instance, you had the 6 founding members of the EU, Spain, probably Greece, and then I think most of the rest of Europe, so all of Scandinavia, most of Eastern Europe being part of EFTA. Yeah, I think Britain would have been very powerful and influential within EFTA, and I think that France and Germany would have been very influential within the EU, more so even than they are today. Because while a lot of the policies within the EU have been very Franco-German in their orientation, I think without Britain also being within the top 3, I think that the policy of the EU would have been far more orientated towards this Franco-German axis. That's a very different kind of Europe that we can imagine. I'm not necessarily going to say that this is what Europe would have been like. I think that given all the information like that we have, I think that it's likely that you had these blocks. At the same time, there's nothing to say that those countries in Eastern Europe and all the other places that eventually joined the EU wouldn't have eventually joined anyway. In the next video, we're actually going to go off of the alternative history series for a little bit, because we just need to cover what I think are the top 10 countries to leave the EU. I'm not saying that they will. It's not looking at necessarily opinion polls. It's saying that if any of these top 10 countries were to leave, which are the ones which have the strongest economic argument for leaving. So barring everything else, just looking at economics, looking at trade, looking at net contribution, etc., and seeing which countries could feasibly leave if they wanted to and could probably get along quite fine.